Good evening. My name is Ken Harper. I'm a candidate in the United States Senate race here in North Carolina for 2022. And I have a special guest with me this evening, Mr. Ken Raymond, who has many titles here in North Carolina, is a man that wears very many hats. And the reason why I have Mr. Ken Raymond here tonight is actually to talk about his book, The Black Political History from the Arch of Safety into the Mouth of the Lion. And full disclosure, Ken, you're not here as an endorsement. You're here on an educational capacity.
I am.
Just to really, number one, galvanize the GOP party, which that should be the concern of all of us who are conservatives and we love the GOP. And also just to really take a deeper dive into history of the Republican Party from also the standpoint of African Americans and the impact that they've had. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for being here with me, this evening.
Well, thank you, Ken. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm always glad to talk about Black political history. It is a great passion of mine and a subject that I can go on and on about for any length of time. I'm glad to share it. I share it just about every day on social media platforms. So absolutely, I'm more than happy to share it this evening with anyone who might be watching.
Great, awesome. Well, you know, it's very interesting how you came into my life. When I made my initial announcement to enter into the United States Senate race, I met some great constituents in Guilford County, a part of the GOP, and there was this nice lady that she gave me your book and put it in my hands and said, "Do you know Ken Raymond?" I was like, "No." "Have you read his book?" I was like, "No, I haven't." She was like, "Well, you need to read his book." And the night that I read your book, I went home. It must have been about 5 o'clock or so. And I didn't get finished till maybe like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So my wife, she was a little begrudging with you that night. I couldn't put your book down. It's a page turner. Just really from my own historical research, your book just, I had my cake, but you were the icing on the cake along with the candles. So, truly you made an impact. And I must say this, and then I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your history and how you got here and some of the things that you're doing in the community, and we'll talk about the book. But just from the perspective of when I started reading your book, it just opened up my eyes to information that I just was not aware of. And it's amazing how this information isn't taught in the schools. And so I was searching for you on social media. I was on LinkedIn, and I was sending you messages. I was like, "Man, would this guy please just respond back?" I just wanted to meet you. I just wanted to talk to you because I felt like, running my campaign, I wanted to have an educational approach, but I just wanted to have your permission to utilize your book as a part of a part of my campaign that could really help educate people. And so in June of this year, you were on a panel with the North Carolina Black Conservative Voices.
I was.
And I walked in the room and I said, "Oh my God, that's Ken Raymond." Hey, Ken. I was so excited that God allowed you to come into my life, and I got to shake your hand and exchange your numbers. And
I remember you managed to work your way up to the front and sit next to my wife.
Absolutely. So you had two of your biggest fans right there on the front row there at the GOP convention. So again, man, just want to thank you for what you're doing. But give us a little bit of your background. Tell us a little bit about you, your beautiful family, and how you started this work, Ken.
Well, I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I came down to Winston-Salem on a football scholarship to Winston-Salem State University, where I played football for a few years. Majored in English and Mass Communications.
Okay.
Graduated in 1987, and my plan at that time was to be a journalist, but things didn't work out, things changed, and I ended up working for the police department, from which I retired a few years ago in 2017. In 1994, I decided to get active in politics and in the political party. And I joined Forsyth County Republican Party, the Young Republicans at that time.
Wow.
And we talked earlier, I've been involved in local and state politics for about 27 years now, in a number of different positions. And around 2002, I met the original members of the North Carolina Frederick Douglass Foundation.
Wow.
That was Tim Johnson, and Kevin Daniels.
Okay.
Tim Johnson and Kevin Daniels. I think you've met Kevin Daniels.
Yes, absolutely.
And the Frederick Douglass Foundation, as you know, they're an organization here in North Carolina, and they in DC. They teach and promote the principles in which took Frederick Douglass from the plantation into business, that made him a free man, that made him a scholar, an author, an international speaker. They take the principles that took him, the principles that he applied to his own life, and transformed his life from slavery into an international figure. And they teach that to the Black community. So I met these individuals, Kevin Daniels and Tim Johnson. And we talked and we got to know each other. And they handed me some materials that they hand out to new members of the Frederick Douglass Foundation. And it was some history. And I still remember. They handed some materials that showed me things that I had never known before about how active Blacks were in politics during the 19th century, and the connection between the Black community and the Republican Party. So it just absolutely fascinated me. So I couldn't just stop there with that. They had brochures and handouts that they give to individuals. And I could not stop with the handout. So I took those brochures and those handouts and I dug behind them and I found more information. And then I found more and more and more. And then I suddenly couldn't get enough. And that set me on a path towards research and writing that I was not planning for myself at all.
Interesting.
So I find, look, everything I found out led me to somewhere else. And it's just staggering, the information that I found. And I decided, I really can't keep this to myself. So I created, and it was about during that time where Facebook started to blow up and other social media platforms started to blow up. So I'm like, okay, so I have a way to share this information that I'm learning. So I have a reason to dig even more, to share it with all these people out there on Facebook. So that was my excuse to read even more. So I'm reading everything that I get my hands on. Frederick Douglass has two. He has two autobiographies out there. I read them both, and everything that I found out and learned about him, I posted it on social media. I found autobiographies from individuals from the 19th century that served in Congress, that were Black congressmen. I read theirs. And then the day I struck gold, the day I absolutely struck gold, was when I found letters written by Frederick Douglass himself in the Library of Congress website. I mean, in his own hand. And he's talking about individuals from his era and his time period that you don't hear about, you don't read about in schools. Frederick Douglass, he's talking about Ulysses S. Grant. He's talking about Abraham Lincoln. He's talking about individuals in his era and what he really thinks about them. And you can read it and it's still there. So
interesting.
So that's how I got started. That's what set me down the path. But then I also had some questions that I needed answers to about the Black community itself. Why, as a group, we're all individuals, but as a group, we tend to do certain things as a group. And the biggest thing that was on my mind during that time was we all vote, or 90, I guess to be more accurate, a high 90% of us vote Democrat. And and I wanted an answer to that. I wanted to know, why does that happen?
Right.
So I was already on that track of studying our history. So I focused in on that.
Interesting.
And I just went back in time to get as much information, to hear it from individuals who lived during that time, who actually wrote about their lives, their autobiographies, or biographies that I found written by other people, to understand why we do some of the things we do, why we are the way we are, and I took it forward. And I found out a lot of information. Posting it on Facebook was not enough, and I ended up writing this book.
Wow. So, amazing history and journey you took to really get to the Black political history. And obviously you had so many different opportunities that really just allow you to grow in your knowledge just from those resources that you found. And I'll tell you, the Library of Congress is a great place of, I had the opportunity to visit it pre-COVID. So it's one of the most amazing places you can go to, and the resources are limitless. But let's segue to the formation of the GOP, okay? And we want to talk about how the GOP really was created and strategically here in the South. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. That's one of the most interesting things, and one of the most incredible things that got me started on this path.
Okay.
One of the materials that I received from Tim and Kevin talked about the formation of the Republican Party, and they talked about those first state executive committee meetings and central committee meetings during that time, and they explained how the membership of those committees in the southern states, they were 95% Black, and they are all Republican.
Wow.
These committees, the state executive committee, the state central committee, they formed the state party organization. They were the founders of the state parties. So what essentially happened was when slavery ended and Black people became free in the southern states, the state Republican Party within these states were formed by former slaves themselves.
Wow.
It's, and I was shocked to find out individuals like Abraham Galloway.
Right.
Abraham Galloway, a former slave who he escaped slavery, worked as a Union spy, and he was one of the founders of the North Carolina Republican Party. He was one of the first members of the State Central Committee, and served also in the General Assembly. He was a founder of today's state NCGOP.
So a former slave in North Carolina who was a spy for the Union actually helped formate the political force here in North Carolina for the GOP. That's just interesting history that a lot of people may not know. And another interesting piece of history that you don't hear a whole lot about, I don't remember learning much about it in school, is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, we're all familiar with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes.
And obviously, 65, we had voter rights passed. But 1875?
1875.
And so, tell us about the construct of that legislation, and who was involved.
Okay, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was proposed by Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner.
Okay.
He proposed the act. I think at first in 1873 he offered it in the Senate, and of course it was challenged.
Right.
And it was the Democrats fought it. And basically, what that bill was, the Civil Rights Act of 1873 at the time. The Civil Rights Act of 1873 or 1875, which was the same bill, was basically the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Yes, the same Civil Rights Act, the same items and same provisions that were in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Lyndon Johnson, was in the Civil Rights Act of 1875 under Ulysses S. Grant.
Which you also talk about your book in your book in 1957, the Civil Rights Act.
Yes.
And I believe some of the provisions were removed by Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yes, that was under President Eisenhower in 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1957. But yes, it was the same information. However, the difference was in 1957 when the Eisenhower administration offered the Civil Rights Act, the Democrats said that they didn't want anything to do with it. They just fought it tooth and nail. They wanted to see it destroyed. Well, let me back up there. They did want to see it destroyed. However, they didn't want to appear that they were against it.
Okay.
Because at that time, like 1957, the Civil
Civil
Rights
rights
Act, you had Martin Luther King it was at its peak.
Absolutely.
And people were beginning to change. The South was beginning to change. The hearts and minds were beginning to change. And Johnson knew that. Southern Democrats knew that. So they wanted to defeat the bill, but they didn't want to appear to defeat the bill. They wanted to appear to be in favor of the bill.
Okay.
So what happened was, all of this is in another autobiography I read was Eisenhower.
Okay.
What happened there was Johnson and Senate Democrats, they allowed the bill to pass, but they removed while during a debate on the Senate floor, they removed the enforcement provisions that were in the bill. So the bill passed, but there was no way to enforce it by law. It absolutely was just no way. So it was toothless and powerless. So the bill passed. Eisenhower didn't want to sign it. He wanted to veto it because the Democrats outmaneuvered him, and they passed the Civil Rights Act with no enforcement positions. He wanted to veto it, but then he knew what would happen. The Democrats and the media would say, "Oh, well, Eisenhower's against civil rights.
Absolutely.
He vetoed the bill."
Right.
And
So he was 22. He was between a rock and a hard spot.
He was between a rock and a hard place.
Wow.
But then Martin Luther King came along, and he told him sign the bill.
Right. Interesting. I would like to segue back a little bit, and also go back to the 19th century when we had the formation of the Republican Party, and I may not have all the strategic dates, but I believe the GOP was formulated sometime around the late 1850s from the Whig Party.
1854.
Okay, and to really focus on the abolishment of slavery.
That was the primary plank in the platform.
Okay, and so the 13th Amendment, which wasn't passed until after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was primarily with a Republican-controlled Senate. The Democrats fought against the 13th Amendment. They fought against the 14th Amendment to make African Americans citizens, and they fought against the 15th Amendment to give African Americans the right to vote. So I think that's an imperative history. Now I would like to talk a little bit about World War II. Okay, and can you talk a little bit? I know we were supposed to. It's just some other stuff in your book that's just coming to my mind. So I want to talk a little bit about the New Deal under FDR. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And because that was one of the first times that African Americans voted in large proportion for Democrats, due to obviously they were in a Great Depression. And I believe you talk about the Depression, the seduction, and
Seduction of communists.
Yes. So can you talk a little bit about that New Deal and the seduction of communism, and how many African Americans were recruited over in Russia during World War II, and just a little bit of that construct there.
Okay, well, to get a clear picture of those events, I have to back up a little bit and talk about the events of 1876, 1877.
Okay. The Great Compromise.
The great, yes,
Yes.
The Compromise of 1877.
Okay.
That was a presidential election year in which Rutherford Hayes was running for president, and it escapes me now who the Democrat challenger was. It was neither candidate received a number of electoral votes to win.
Right.
And what happened there was a commission was created to work all of this out.
Absolutely.
And it was a number of Democrats, a number of Republicans, and some federal judges were on this commission, and they would work it out. However,
there was a
backroom deal.
Yes.
At a Washington D.C. hotel.
Yes, it was.
In which a number of congressional Republicans and Democrats met, and they made a deal.
Right.
The deal was the Democrats made the deal, and the deal was they said that they would support Rutherford Hayes to be president if you end Reconstruction in the South. The Republicans resisted that. There were some that resisted that because they knew that what would happen. Right. They knew that Southern Democrats they would take the South back to pre-Civil War times.
And so, in essence, would you say that major compromise, because we know also later they removed the federal soldiers that were there protecting the people and keeping peace there in the South. Would you say that was the beginning point?
That was the beginning
of black disenfranchisement.
Yes, that was definitely that was the beginning.
Okay.
So. If you think about it too, it was awful because you had blacks during that presidential election in 1876/1877 because the election went on. It didn't end, kind of like today.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. You had that election that just wouldn't end. You had black people that went out, risked their lives to vote for Rutherford Hayes. Right. And then he turned and betrayed them. Yeah. So that was a shocker.
Of course.
Interesting thing about that is that you had Frederick Douglass out there still promoting the Republican Party because he's even after that, even after that major betrayal, Frederick Douglass understood and he knew, yes, the Republicans, they've helped us, they've helped end slavery, but you have to keep in mind they're not perfect, they're not angels, they are ambitious, they have vices. Just like any other men. Keep that in mind.
Hence your title.
Yeah.
From the Ark of Safety into the Mount of the Lion.
He described the Republican Party as the Ark of Safety.
Yes.
For political safety for black men. So stay under the Ark of Safety. We'll work all this other stuff out.
Absolutely.
So, but that was the first major problem, and that led to Democrats taking over the South, southern states, reestablishing themselves throughout state government. That led to the institutionalization of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, segregation, legalized segregation throughout the South was after 1877. It was written in state constitutions. It was written in state laws. It was written, in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, all throughout the South. That's when that happened. So you fast forward to, and then during that period, there were a lot of lynchings going on. So let's fast forward up to the 1920s. You had a Mississippi Republican that offered, his name was Dyer, Congressman Dyer, Leonidas Dyer, that was his name, Leonidas Dyer. He offered a bill, an anti-lynching bill. And his bill made lynching a federal crime because lynching was rampant throughout the South during the first part of the 20th century. So he offered a anti-lynching bill, and he was working with the NAACP, which formed immediately after the 1900s started.
Okay.
So it was Dyer, Congressman Dyer from Mississippi, and the NAACP. They were educating people about what's going on in the South because communication wasn't what it is today.
Right.
Back then.
Right.
And people just didn't know.
Right.
And the media didn't tell it.
Right.
So you had Congressman Dyer going across the country, speaking at events, talking about what's going on in the South. Republican congressman from Mississippi, working with the NAACP, and their NAACP is putting full-page ads out there. He offers the bill in the Senate to make lynching a federal crime. At that time, it was 1922. At that time, Republicans had the majority in the Senate. It was a small majority, but a majority nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats were determined to defeat the bill. And they filibustered, and they filibustered, and they filibustered. James Weldon Johnson was there encouraging the Republicans and NAACP officials, saying, this is life and death.
Right.
People are dying out there on trees and getting shot and lynched. Right. We've got to fight. But the Democrats, they filibustered, and they filibustered, and they just held up everything. And then the Republicans caved. They fell apart. They surrendered. They had the majority in the Senate. It passed the House, came to the Senate, and so Republicans surrendered. And James Weldon Johnson, he did not. I mentioned it in the book. He did not hold back after that. He just ripped the Republicans after that.
Okay.
So, and everybody was watching this. Everybody was watching this. Will the anti-lynching law pass? And then it failed because Republicans lost their nerve.
So I think that's a good point to kind of head towards the latter question that I asked you about World War II.
Yes, yes.
Because of that great compromise that you're speaking on. Okay, we obviously know that during that time, black people were really in a precarious situation where obviously the Democrats were doing everything they could to keep us pre-Civil War period. And now their arc of safety truly was becoming compromised. And so talk a little bit about how communism came into the fold during that period of time, maybe a decade or so.
It was about a decade. It was about a decade. So when the anti-lynching law failed, the black community, especially in the South. Now you have to remember, blacks did vote in the North, in the Midwest, and out in the West. However, in the South it was different. When the anti-lynching law failed, Southern blacks didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. The Republican Party was, as Frederick Douglass called, the ark of safety for them, and they surrendered. They didn't know what to do. There was a mass migration out of the South. And they went to big cities. They went to New York. They went to Boston. They went to Chicago. They went to a number of different places. They went to California. And in these big cities, waiting for them with open arms was the Communist Party. The Communist Party. And they embraced the black community and said, the Democrats hate you. They want to lynch you. The Republicans let you down. You have no representation in Washington, D.C. Everything, these institutions have failed you. We as communists will embrace you and help you have the lives that you deserve. So just help us promote and spread the Communist Party, and we'll make all these things happen for you. And that message it got through to much of the black community. It did, and that's how it all started. You had communists, and it was open back then. I mean, you had people back then during the 1930s and 40s. You had people on street corners, on soapboxes, passing out flyers to communist meetings. Wow. Communist Party meeting at 10th and Trade. And they were very open about it, and it was attended heavily by the black community because the political system let them down, and they had nowhere else to turn. So they gave this a shot, and that's how socialism and communism crept so strongly into the black community back then.
Wow.
There was even a black presidential candidate, communist for the Communist Party. In the 1940s, it was James Ford. A lot of people don't know about him.
No,
James Ford.
You really hear that name.
Yeah, you never heard that name.
Yeah.
But the first black man that made the ballot in America as a presidential candidate.
And he was a vice president.
That's right. He was a vice president. That's right. He was a vice president candidate.
Okay.
The presidential candidate was a major communist. He was a vice presidential candidate, James Ford, and he was on the ballot as a communist. And when black people saw that back then, they said, "Oh, we need to be communists."
Wow.
So, but the thing is, this relationship, this seduction with the communists, it didn't last long because of World War II.
Obviously, we know the fallacy of communism and that period. I mean, in the 20th century, over 100 million people have deaths have been linked to communism, which is a system that truly doesn't work. We know that it is a demonstrative system that destroys a society, and we have to push back against it in America that we have a democratic republic, and we definitely have to remain strong with this historical context that I think is so imperative that all Americans understand this, because I think really at this moment in time that we are right now, this history really needs to be told.
Yes, it does.
So definitely, I would love for us to go back to the beginning of our conversation. There's so many hot topics, Ken.
Yes,
talking to you, man, I just get excited, man. I go a little bit too fast, but this is just, I get excited about history. I want to go back to 1875.
Okay.
Civil rights.
Well, going back to the 19th century.
Yes, absolutely. Let's go back to the 19th century. I wish we had a crystal ball or something. We could just go back. But anyway, talk about the Civil Rights Bill of 1875.
Okay. After much delay and many obstacles placed before the bill in its passage by Democrats, it finally made made it to the House floor for debate and for a vote.
Okay.
Now, unfortunately, the author of the bill, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, he died before it could make it to the floor. And one of the things is reportedly said on his deathbed was to make sure the bill passed. This man was a committed abolitionist.
Wow.
A committed abolitionist who wanted to see the black community free. So the bill makes it to the floor. And Congressman M.C. Butler pretty much was handling things from that point forward. And Congressman Butler, he thought it would be a good idea, since we're talking about Civil Rights Act, and remember the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was basically the same thing, had the same provisions of 1964.
Interesting.
So Congressman Butler, he thought it would be most appropriate if the black Republican congressman would lead the debate.
Interesting.
For the passage of that bill. Now, during that time, we had a number of black Republican congressmen in Congress. We had Robert Brown Elliott. We had Robert Smalls. We had, I can see his face.
Was Hyman Revels there during that period?
Hiram Revels was in the Senate.
Okay.
But I think he had left at that time.
Okay.
But we had a number of black Republicans we had, it will come to me while we're talking.
That's okay.
But we had a number of black Republicans in the House at that time.
Yes.
And Congressman Butler said, okay, this is civil rights for blacks. You guys should be out front for this. And the black Republicans at that time, they accepted the challenge. They were going to lead the debate.
Interesting.
And word got out
Wow.
that the black Republicans in Congress were going to lead the debate for the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
Oh, wow.
They were going to debate, and some of them were former slaves. They were going to debate against former slave owners.
Wow.
You know, when I talk about this, I always tell people this would make a great movie.
Yeah, it would. Hey, who knows? Maybe we can produce it.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah, but you had, just imagine, on the floor of the House, you had former slaves debating against former slave owners for the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Interesting.
And the media attention was it was fantastic.
I'm sure.
I mean, this situation got great media attention. I mean, they didn't even have to try to promote it.
The great debacle.
Yeah, I mean, the media was all over this, and when the day came to have the debate, the gallery was full of people, black and white. They wanted to see this.
Right.
You know, the Democrats, of course, they were arrogant, and you know, they thought, "Oh, we got this. We got this." I mean, you got them ignorant Negroes over there going to try to engage in a formal debate against us. You know, they halfway tried.
Right.
So the debate started, and Robert Brown Elliott was among the first to step up to the podium and speak. And when it was all said and done, the black Republicans cleaned the floor with them.
Wow.
They wiped the floor with them. I mean, they were ready. Elliott, for example, Robert Brown Elliott, he always came prepared for a debate.
Yeah.
Whenever he always came prepared for a meeting. He had everything he wanted to say.
Wow.
He had points of law. He had the Constitution. He had history. He had scriptures.
Wow.
Already.
Interesting.
Yes. Already lined up his papers ready to say whatever he wanted to say in the debate. And you had the others who engaged in the debate. You had Joseph Hayne Rady. He was another one. Joseph Hayne Rady. He was another individual that participated in the debate. And they just thrilled the crowd. They thrilled the gallery. And people were on the edge of their seats listening to them, and they did not know that black people could be so articulate and so eloquent and be so courageous in speaking in favor of their rights. The Democrats had the former vice president of the Confederate States in that debate. And Robert Brown Elliott just wiped his feet on it. I mean, he just destroyed him. In a one-on-one debate, he just absolutely, and people couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe what they were saying.
Wow, what an interesting contrast when you look at the victimhood mantra that wants to be taunted and promoted today, especially amongst critical race theory being taught in school, especially when you have such strong-minded African Americans, former slaves who truly, you know, galvanized and formed the GOP, fought head to head, shoulder to shoulder with their former slave masters, and articulated legislation with great oratory skills
and great courage.
It's amazing.
This story is, I believe, and when I talk about it with people, you know, I get a little angry that it's still not in schools today.
Interesting.
It's not taught in schools today. The speeches are still available online. You can read the speeches of these gentlemen that engaged in this debate, and you can learn from them, and it can inspire you, and you can learn for yourself that even in that era where racism was as prevalent as it was, these individuals did not let it stop them, and they just persisted, and they continued, and they were victorious.
So attitude determines your altitude.
Yes, absolutely. and eventually they prevailed. They were victorious. When it came time to vote, the bill passed. They defeated the Democrats. It passed the House. It passed the Senate. It was signed by Ulysses S. Grant.
Wow.
The bill was in place. Unfortunately, that was 1875. Unfortunately, in 1883, the Supreme Court declared the Civil Rights Act unconstitutional.
Interesting.
And that's what happened to it.
Wow. Do you remember the justice name? Was it Harper? No. Do you remember the justice name?
There was a justice, as a matter of fact, on that court in 1883, whose great-grandson or his grandson was on the Supreme Court during the Eisenhower administration.
Interesting.
And he was a dissenting judge. His name wasn't Harlan, was it? Harlan, that's his name. His name was Harlan.
Okay.
He was a dissenting justice, and he wrote the dissent in that decision that struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
Interesting.
And the interesting thing was, Justice Harlan's, I think it was his grandson, ended up on the Supreme Court in 1957 under Eisenhower. He ended up on the Supreme Court under Eisenhower, and he helped pass Brown versus the Board of Education.
Wow. That is truly amazing. So I'm glad you shared that. Now I really want to share a short excerpt from your book, and again, the Black political history from the Arch of Safety into the mouth of the lion. I'm here today with Ken Raymond, and we're talking, if you're just joining us, about his great work here. I want to talk a little bit about the big switch, which a lot of people relate a lot of false information and false narratives as to how African Americans, switched to the Democratic Party. But I just want to share this real quick. Two of the biggest parts of the Democrats' misinformation campaign are known today as the A, the big switch, and the B, the Southern strategy, or Nixon's Southern strategy. Both rely heavily on placing the blame for black oppression upon Republicans. In the big switch, college professors, historians, media elites, and university professors from America's most prestigious schools teach and promote and cultivate the belief that Democrats and Republicans actually switched positions on the issue of race in America. That certainly is convenient for the Democrats. It is not. They teach after fighting the Civil War to end slavery, enshrining the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into the U.S. Constitution, fighting the Ku Klux Klan, fighting to stop the legal lynching of blacks, and opposing Jim Crow laws and segregation. The Republican Party made a 180-degree turn and decided to oppress blacks, exchanging their policy of freedom for the Democrats' policy of oppression. Talk to me.
It's just amazing. It's absolutely amazing. But the thing is about the big switch, leading up to the big switch, the Democrats began to see where the Southern vote was going. Everyday Southerners, they were beginning to see that their tradition was not wrong. Truman helped them with that. Truman, he was a Southerner. He was a Southerner that was in favor of civil rights. Maybe that's what it took. I don't know. But Truman, as president and as a Southerner himself, fought hard, and he was a Democrat, for the passage of a Civil Rights Act. And that probably played a role. But the hardcore Democrats that wanted to keep segregation and keep oppression in the South, they wanted to keep it in place. They began to see the tide turning against them. So when the time came up, it was presidential election year 1968, and it was Nixon running for president. Leading up to that election, the Democrats always won. The Democrats always won the Southern states. They called the Southern states the Solid South. There was no question the Democrat candidate would always win the Southern states until 1968. What happened leading up to 1968? You had rioting. You had bank robbery. You had open rebellion. You had all the craziness.
Was assassinated.
You had all the craziness of the 60s going on.
George Wallace,
absolutely. You had all this going on, and people were seeing that, and they knew it was coming from the Democrats. They knew that. So they were not, and Wallace, was a candidate in that election. So people saw all of this. You had that madness at the Democrat convention, where you had rioting going on, and they were fighting on the floor of the convention.
Wow.
And
interesting.
So when election year rolled around, the Southern states, for the first time since Reconstruction, they voted Republican.
Okay. Wow.
And the media couldn't believe it.
Wow.
the media couldn't believe it. They were expecting, as always up until that time, the Democrat candidate to win. And but you had Nixon win the southern states. So they needed an explanation for this.
Wow.
They needed a reason. They needed an excuse.
So that's how they created the big switch.
They created the big switch.
Okay.
They created Nixon's Southern strategy.
Wow.
They said, okay, what happened was Nixon, the Republican Party, adopted racist rhetoric and content. They actually switched platforms with the Democrats. And that's what happened. Nixon was talking a racist dialect, and that wasn't true. It was George Wallace.
Yes, yes, exactly.
It was George Wallace in that election. But yet, they pushed it, they pushed it, they pushed it. It was in the media, it was taught. And it, and it stuck.
Right.
And even looking back on all of this, when I was in college, I believed it too.
Interesting.
I did until I got out of college and started reading for myself.
I'm glad you bring this context because I might be able to get some of my friends back. Nonetheless, we really want to, have an opportunity to put forth the true historical history and historical events that have evolved that now truly are embedded in the minds of people, and a lot of the misinformation. So if I can go back a little bit, I'd like to go back to the early 20th century under FDR, and talk a little bit about the New Deal.
Oh, the New Deal.
During the Great Depression, one of the points you actually bring out in the book is unemployment for blacks during that time was 40 to 50+%.
Yes, it was.
And so they really were in a very precarious situation.
They were desperate.
Yes.
Absolutely desperate situation. You had families living out in the street, not living anywhere they could, under any shelter they could find.
Wow.
And they were going to take help from anywhere they could get it. And then you had FDR to come along and his New Deal. And his New Deal put food on the table.
Right.
And that's what, and black people were grateful for that. They didn't have to wonder anymore, where is their next meal coming from? Right. How is their baby going to get fed?
Right.
The federal government's going to do it.
Right.
The federal government, they will take care of us. One thing I found out in my research was that the benefits they received during that time was a lot less than white people received, but they were still grateful.
Was that under the 1935 Social Security Act administered? So were they receiving benefits up under that 1935 Social Security Act?
They were.
But they were drastically reduced.
They were drastically reduced.
Okay.
And a number of people, community leaders, walked around and talked and got some information from individuals, because after the election, I believe it was after the election, and and FDR had won so many black votes, and they told him, well, the Democrats hate you.
Right.
They absolutely hate you, and you're supporting them in such great numbers. Why is that? And the answer was, because they're feeding us, because they're giving us food during hard times and during times in which we don't know where our children's going to eat. So as long as we know that we're being taken care of, that other stuff doesn't matter. That was a common response after interviewing several black people in the Midwest. They put all of that aside just for security. They put everything. They put their dignity aside.
Right.
They put the freedom aside for the security of a meal. And that aspect within the black community, unfortunately, is still there.
Interesting. So it really appears as from this discussion, 2 points that resonate with me. One is the period of time in the 1877 compromise, when obviously the Republicans compromised, and we already knew where the Democrats stood. African Americans during that period ran towards communism, and also were willing to embrace a party that pretty much hated them just to put food on the table.
Yes.
Under severe pressure
Yes.
points, we can basically make some faulty decisions.
Yes.
That also can really long term have a drastic effect for generations. Because we know the government just from there just continued to grow during the civil rights era, after the assassination of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, with the Great Society. Those policies were just devastating.
He learned from FDR.
Interesting.
He learned.